The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 3. Bring him in,
yelled Pell, as his guards moved towards the door to his throne room. The large wooden double doors were thrown open, and more guards entered, dragging with them the chained, beaten, and bloodied body of young Dan Tenuvial. He was forced down to his knees by the guards before Pell Tavor, the governor of Bishopsgate, and current object of Dan's unsatisfied revenge.
So this is the golden boy thief. Looks more bloodied than golden.
Dan's face was badly bruised and swollen grotesquely above his right eye, having sustained a savage beating at the hands of the keep's angry prison guards. He had avoided capture and their detection for nearly 7 years, and the military police were tired of being so embarrassed. They were eager to end his life quickly.
So, what say you, boy, in your defense?
The Governor Pell asked rhetorically.
I am Dan Tenuvial, son of Ulrich, the rightful Lord of Alinor.
Dan coughed out defiantly, still fighting for consciousness. His eyes were stinging from the mix of sweat and blood that filled them.
My father Ulrich told me to tell you. The orcs have gathered. But I suppose you know all about that, don't you?
Pell had already absorbed what remained of Alinor into his own governance, and spent considerable wealth to rebuild it. He would hear no more of any contrary claims to its ownership or his governance.
You are nothing but a thief and a kidnapper. You mingle freely with the subraces and aid them in the deceit of our people. You've defied your lord long enough, and now your short, meaningless life is about to meet its judgment.
Behind Pell stood his adult son Quell, whose eyes lit up with satisfaction.
Father, he claims to be a bastard Tenuvial, an Ulrich son. Hear how he openly admits it. He has come here to usurp your throne and steal your lands.
Dan had petitioned me to assassinate Pell several times, but he is well defended. His son, Quell, had a large church of zealots, and was rumored to be training dark knights within its temple.
Allow me to strike the final blow,
asked Quell, gripping his iron mace eagerly.
No, I should have the right. I demand my revenge,
cried Captain Aros.
He violated my daughter.
Violated? Violated,
asked both Pell and his son Quell simultaneously. Pell, who seemed curious, and Quell, one of her many suitors, seemed devastated at the notion. Aros was angry, but his accusation bespoke uncertainty. Tria was summoned.
Bring in the girl. If this is true, I shall have him castrated as well.
When Tria entered, she immediately raced to Dan's side, crying. She begged the governor for mercy.
Please, do not kill him. He is innocent. He merely showed me his world and helped you find the thief's hidden fortress.
Aros grabbed his daughter by the arm and pulled her away from the young prisoner, as she kicked and screamed. All the men present were confounded by how Dan had taken her heart so quickly and completely. Aros pulled his sword from his scabbard. Dan did not move.
No, father, please!
Cried out Tria in desperation.
Wait,
ordered Pell.
Young Tria, did this boy violate you?
Pell asked in a tone of mischievous curiosity.
He did not. He is innocent,
she cried. Pell and his son Quell were both relieved, but Aros remained unsatisfied.
Well then, golden boy thief, luckily for you, you may keep your manhood intact, whilst I bring my justice down upon you.
Before he could render his verdict, 2 young men of distinction approached Pell to offer unwanted counsel. One appeared to be a warrior, He was tall and sleek, while the other was clearly a man of the gods. The cleric whispered into Pel's ear in secret. Pel moved his head away from the priest's lips abruptly, staring back with disdain. He was appalled by what he was hearing.
Nonsense,
Pel retorted.
There can be no redemption for this boy. We must make an example of him.
But the young priest persisted. He spoke aloud for all to hear.
Begging your pardon, Governor, but my high priest, Keelan Thiel, has sent me to deliver this message. This keep is the property of the Grand Bishop of Kirk, and our clergy is sovereign in acts of justice and mercy. This young boy was clearly under the spell of the evildoers, and shows great promise as a warrior for the agents of the light,
said Fergus of Ebok, a confident young cleric and newly made member of the Order of the Sacred Fire.
Father, don't let them do this,
interjected Quell. He turned defiantly to Fergus, squaring himself aggressively before him, forcing more distance between the benevolent priest and his father.
I am a cleric of Moskal, and this keep has been ordained in his name. It is no longer the province of your northern gods. Begone from here, Abbot of Ebok. You may not have this one. He is ours, and we shall exact our justice. I shall have my revenge, priest. He stole my daughter from my home,
yelled Aros in full-throated support of Quell's defiance.
If you choose to defy the order, you will all be held to account for it.
Fergus spoke powerfully.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, merciful priest. Please spare him,
interjected Tria, hopeful Fergus might be able to spare Dan's life.
Father, don't let them do
please.
this. Stop embarrassing him.
Please.
He must die.
Silence!
Yelled Pel in despair of the chaos of the proceedings before his court. He looked down to the battered and beaten boy who at this young age had created so much controversy and had made so many inexplicable friends and enemies. Pel was truly vexed. He stammered for his next words.
Why does the great Keelan Thiel care about this boy? Why has he sent you?
He pressed Fergus.
What the boy tells is true. He was in our care as a child of Alinor, before the attack by the Horde killed his family. He is of our flock. The high priest lost many of his faithful herd in the dreadful attack by those evildoers. Keelan Thiel now demands this lost, fatherless child be returned and repatriated to where he belongs. We will look after him and rehabilitate him.
Fergus' voice commanded with the palpable aid of unseen supernatural powers. Pel was cornered politically, though he had taken great effort to distance himself from the sect that Fergus represented. The young cleric was the messenger of the powerful and elite Order of the Sacred Fire. The Order was world-renowned for nearly 3 centuries as a powerful force of fighting men, clerics, and magic users. They were the bringers of justice, and to be on the contrary side of their ruling or missions would be very dangerous. They were not to be trifled with. Pel had much to lose by taking young Dan's life. He had no choice but to grant the young cleric's wish. He scowled.
Take him, then.
The room filled with gasps and grunts of disagreement, and Tria's cries for mercy answered.
But take him far away from here, and keep him there. If I ever see his face again in my lands, there will be no mercy.
Aros and Quell were both outraged. Tria continued to cry, but for a newfound reason. Her despair was knowing that Dan, though spared, would be gone. Her father dragged her away from the hall in disgust. As the door slammed behind them, her cries dissipated. All that was left was a cold silence. Fergus approached Dan with his calm and peaceful demeanor. He placed his right hand on Dan's forehead, and he spoke a soft prayer. The wounds that Dan had suffered were healed suddenly and miraculously, revealing his bold, beautiful face once again. Fergus then stood up and demanded the guards unshackle him. They did, and he took Dan away, as was demanded. Dan and Quell's eyes met again as Dan left the throne room with Fergus. Their eyes were fixed on each other's stare, both sets of eyes emblazoned with such intense animosity that it seemed certain fate would inevitably see one claim of deep-seated vengeance met. Dan left the governor's throne room and then followed quickly behind Fergus. The priest's long curls of jet-black hair seemed a contrary image to the heavenly peace that followed all about him, like an orb of godly contentment. Dan was drawn to his protection, but frightened by his compassion. Since the death of his family, very few people, aside from myself, had ever shown him any compassion. It occurred to Dan in hindsight that perhaps I offered this care simply as a means to use him, as Theb suggested. Everyone had an evil side, a dark and selfish quadrant of their soul that helped keep them alive. Every person was servant to their own agenda, with a compulsion to embrace that side of ourselves which was not at all holy, but of worldly want and selfish desire. Surely Dan would also see that from Fergus, eventually. But for now, he was grateful to make his escape from Bishop's Gate. His life had been spared, and freedom gave him another chance to have his promised revenge. As they made their way through the narrow halls and stairs of the keep towards the courtyard, Dan looked back to inspect the swordsman who followed quietly behind them both. He was tall, thin, and a bit older than Fergus. His eyes never left Dan, for clearly he was not completely akin in the mindset. This seeming naked innocence the young priest possessed. He was his protector, and just like Theb, showed Dan his distrust with his narrow, focused gaze. The trio made their way through the jeers, the rotted food and gobs of shit hurled at them by the angry populace, who would not get the promised execution of the Golden Boy today. The three moved quickly past the angry crowd until they reached a horse and stagecoach bearing the flag and insignia of the Order of the Sacred Fire. They entered a small staging house nearby the carriage and shut the door behind them.
We may not have much time. Hurry. Get yourself bathed and changed. It will be a long ride.
The priest offered. He handed Dan some clean clergy garb.
Where are we going?
Asked Dan.
To a much better place.
Fergus responded with a smile.
Somewhere where you may have a chance at life, perhaps.
Offered the swordsman. Dan was taken aback and assumed a defensive posture.
Don't let him frighten you. Dan, this is Theos. He is my friend and sword-bearer. He is a fighting man, like your father, and is sworn to defend me. He will not harm you.
It puzzled Dan how any man of such pure benevolence could manage to survive in this violent world, or why any man of the sword would care to preserve this esoteric mindset. Dan knew survival only through strength, cunning, and unbending will to overcome the pervasive threats he faced. Embracing peace, compassion, and benevolence seemed a stark contradiction to this fact of his young life. Once cleaned and changed and in the carriage, the group made their way from the city. The large carriage housed a small group of the priest's maidens who had prepared a meal for the three men. Before Fergus and Theos could sit, Dan started devouring the food voraciously.
You dare eat prior to blessing?
Questioned Theos, which again called into question the truth to the priest's defense.
I am not of the sky god.
Dan finished his large bite from the rib of a swine.
Why did you tell this to Pell? I was raised of the mountain god, and his willful destruction of the deceivers.
Dan said while he chewed aloud.
Had I not stretched the truth in your favor, your corpse would now be food for the boars, and you would not be here, eating one.
Fergus smiled again and motioned for Dan to place the rib back on the plate before him. He offered a prayer.
Where there is light, there is truth.
And the three started their supper in a more civilized fashion.
We thank you all, Father, for this meal. When I heard of your exploits and the legend that you were an Ulrich son, and of the Tinuvio clan, I was commanded by my high priest to come to your aid. We were once allied with King Owen and your father in the battle against the Horde. He was a great fighting man. You knew my father?
Asked Dan, dubious. From the look of him, Fergus could only be in his late 20s.
Yes, I did. I never fought with him, but I was an emissary for the clergy in Eleanor for nearly a year. You might not remember, you were a very small boy.
Dan did not remember Fergus, but he did remember being a small boy when Eleanor was sacked by orcs, which begged his next question.
How was it that the orc horde made it to Eleanor in such great numbers? They must have been helped. That has never made sense to me.
Questioned Dan, now piqued with curiosity of what these purported wise men and their masters may actually know.
Nor to us. That is among the reasons why my high priest has summoned you. We need insight on how these chaotic creatures seem so suddenly organized and so well equipped. After destroying Eleanor, they marched north and attacked Teton, and they even reached the outer villages of Ebok. This development has troubled us greatly. Why the attack was never prosecuted by Pell also troubles us. As a witness to these events, we had hoped you might shed some light.
Dan thought of the horsemen that wore the bishop insignia and spoke with authority to the orcs. He wanted to explain to them that the governor of Bishop, Pell Tavor himself, was likely involved, but he could not find the words. So he remained silent and ate his dinner. It was clear that these men and their masters had very little knowledge that Dan did not already possess. They were being fooled like everyone else. Dan was still a product of my pessimistic view of humanity. My tutelage fostered his belief that, in the end, men like these would only stand to serve as obstacles of his revenge. Dan's eyes left theirs. He focused on the food. Then he spoke.
For Pell Tavor, I bring only darkness. Despite what you may have promised them, you must know, priest, I will return to Bishop's Gate, and I will have my revenge.
The tone of the meal became much more tense. Dan would not be the easiest stallion for the church to tame. He was filled with a warrior's bloodthirst, just as Theos had warned. Revenge was a vice that the Order forbade with great zeal. But Fergus was still confident in Dan's potential. Keelan Thiel had envisioned it himself, a truly awesome level of godly blessing that had been bestowed upon this orphaned teen boy.
You have much to learn, young Dan. We will show you. For now, eat and rest in the arms of the benevolent one. You're almost home.
Dan slept quite a bit during the trip, which was over 200 miles to the northeast. It was the furthest he had ever traveled in his young life, but the carriage was slow and his new guardians were far less entertaining than the thieves of my lost guild under the city. Dan tried to make more conversation with Theos, but it was clear this man did not trust or approve of him. Theos was very skilled and remarkably intelligent. His aloof comments only distanced Dan further from him. For his part, Fergus would answer Dan's direct and pointed questions with religious rhetoric hidden within long, ancient stories. The morale of these stories were lost on him. Dan's mentions of victory in battle and vengeance gained by the sword only brought counterstatements on the virtues of peace and the true strength of faith. The desire for revenge, as Fergus taught, was only damaging to the one who desired it. It was a fire that burned within, so it only harmed the carrier of the desire. His quixotic teaching was forged in fires that were still completely foreign to Dan. Once again, as night fell, the two bored him to sleep with their benign supernatural folklore. Dan dreamt he was a boy again, fleeing the orcs at Alinor. Only this time, he was running up a mountain to escape. The mountaintop was blanketed by dark clouds that rumbled with thunder and flickered with lightning. Below him, Alinor burned as the snarling orcs chased after him. Each step up the mountain grew harder to take, almost like he was stepping through thick mud. The pursuing orcs closed in behind him. Dan pulled himself up the ridgeline until he was too tired to move on. His face hovered over a small, muddy puddle. The pool rested in a large rock face that jutted out of the mountain with purpose. As he looked into his own reflection, he became incredibly thirsty. He pushed his face into the puddle, trying to lap up some of the water. But he could not feel it or taste it, so it gave him no relief. The puddle rippled as each bolt of lightning flashed, and thunder followed, shaking the rocky ridge. But after it was still again, all Dan could see was his own reflection. His reflection blurred and then became the visage of his mother. Dan's intense love and repressed longing for her surged out, filling him with emotion. Muti looked at him, just as she did on her last day. "Avenge us," she said again. Dan looked up the mountaintop that was now rattling with violent thunder. He tried to sit up, but he couldn't. He noticed his father atop the mountain, motioning for him to come up further, to the top. But Dan could not move. The rock face that bore his mother's image broke off and descended down into the burning valley below. Dan grasped hold of the mountainside, trying to hold on. He called out to his father, and then he awoke. On the other side of the slow-moving carriage, both Fergus and his swordsman Theos were sound asleep. Dan's heart was beating quickly, and his eyes were flush with tears. Instinctively, flight became his best option. He was certain this dream he had just experienced was a direct message from Tyr. There was no revenge to be had on this path with these men of peace. This carriage only served to remove him further away from the destiny of vengeance his family and his god had commanded him to achieve. Dan reached, stealthily, for the bolt on the carriage door and released it quietly, displaying skills I had taught him. The carriage door swung open and he leapt out. After opening fully, it snapped back and reshut. Dan rolled onto the wet soil, then got to his feet, watching nervously as the horse-drawn carriage continued slowly on down the road without him. He then turned the other way and sprinted in the opposite direction. It was night, and it was unseasonably cold. A steady, cold drizzle had been falling for some time. None of the drivers or followers in the other carriages noticed that he had fled the caravan. Dan had no idea where he was going, but ran as fast as he could to get there. After nearly 30 minutes of running, Dan stopped to catch his breath. The cold darkness had surrounded him. He was breathing heavily and trembling with cold. He was also hungry, but had neglected to steal any provisions before fleeing. It was then he started having second thoughts about his actions. Dan then saw a bright light flickering in the woods ahead. As Dan approached cautiously, he realized the light was a small campfire. He stepped closer, looking quietly for its tenders. Yet there was no one in the camp or nearby the fire. There was a tent nearby. Dan approached anxiously, pulled open the flap, and then looked in to find there was no one in it. There was a carafe of water with a cup next to a log-cut seat. Dan looked from side to side and then circled the perimeter of the camp again, but still could not see anyone. He shivered from the cold, so he moved closer to the fire, which burned strongly under the cold drizzle, with very little wood within. He then noticed there was a rabbit on a spit, cooking over the fire. He was certain that it was not there the last time he looked, but he was hungry, so he took it off the spit. He bit into the rabbit. It was hot and delicious. The warmth of the fire, the prepared food, the clean water, the comfortable shelter that was here amidst his solitude in the woods, made Dan very suspicious. It occurred to Dan that this could not be real. He must still be dreaming. That is when he heard a voice pierce through the sound of dropping rain.
The fire is warm, yes?
Dan stood up and assumed a defensive posture as an old man emerged from the shadows. His bearded face flickered in the firelight as he approached.
I called out and did not see anyone. I was hungry and in search of shelter, sir,
replied Dan, looking behind him for others who might now be encircling him.
It appears you have found it.
The old man smiled and took a seat on the ground on the opposite side of the fire from Dan.
That's the beauty of a fire. It offers its warmth equally to all those who surround it. It doesn't choose. But of course you cannot possess it. You can't be too close or within it, or else you'll be burned.
He smiled. Dan took another bite of the rabbit, trying to dissect the strange man's meaning. The rabbit was tender and cooked perfectly.
I'm sorry I stole your food. I was hungry. Eat, young one. I have plenty more food. I have more water. But like you, I prefer to sit beside the warmth of the fire. For I share the fire. And sometimes I feed it.
The old man tossed some dust on the fire that caused it to burn brightly. The fire glowed magically with shifting colors.
Who are you?
Asked Dan, now suspicious that he was being trapped. He dropped the rabbit and spit out the meat he was chewing.
What is this?
The old man smiled.
Fear not, young Dan.
Dan's expression changed as the man acknowledged he knew who he was.
My name is Silas. I am the High Mage of the Order of the Sacred Fire. You were on your way to my home when you decided to run away. Why? Did our messengers offend you?
Dan stood up defensively.
What do you people want from me? Have I been freed from one jailer just to be placed into the hands of another?
The bright white light of the flame dimmed and returned to a slow burn. Silas took a deep breath and exhaled with a smile.
No. You are free to go, Dan.
The old man laughed softly.
I was concerned. But certainly, if you choose, you may leave the side of the fire. Go then, and find your way alone, young Tenuvio. I will tell the others.
The old man whispered something as he turned his back, and with a hand gesture, the fire went out. Then all at once, the camp and the High Mage Silas himself disappeared from sight. All that remained was Dan, alone in the cold, dark, and wet forest. Dan had the sudden realization that he was now in mortal danger. He had leapt from the moving carriage, which had likely traveled several miles north without him by now. He would be unlikely to catch up to it, even with his best effort and his incredible running stamina. Still, catching up to the caravan would only be possible if he could actually find the road it was on, which was now completely obscured from sight, He tried to return to the road, backtracking where he thought he had come from, but fell over a rock and hurt his leg. He cried out.
Tyr, why have you forsaken me here? Where is my path?
The sky rumbled with a thunderclap, and rain poured down even more heavily. Dan yelled out to the sky with all of his voice.
Can you hear me? Why must I be denied my vengeance?
The sky was lit briefly by lightning. Dan tried again to come to his feet, but the pain in his ankle caused him to fall again. He pounded the ground with his fists in anger.
Father, why did you send me away?
He cried out. Once again, the sky filled with light as lightning flashed. This time, Dan could make out the silhouettes of 3 very large men encircling him. In the flash of lightning, they appeared almost as giants. He stopped, and when the lightning flashed again, he saw they were indeed men, standing atop marble pedestals like statues, which added to their stature.
My lord, Tyr, is that you?
Dan asked innocently. The sky was illuminated by the next lightning flash, and Dan could see these were not gods, but men like him. One of them was the old man he had met by the fire.
Silas? Please, forgive me.
The old man dropped his hood and cloak and brought his large wooden staff to bear before him. A pillar of fire erupted from the ground and burned upwards towards the sky, lighting the woods as brightly as the noonday sun. Dan fell back, his eyes filled with fear.
What are you afraid of?
Demanded the High Mage. His eyes no longer held the kindness he saw earlier.
I'm afraid of failing. Failing my father, my family, my people.
Dan responded passionately. The heat of the fire seared his skin, but he did not back away.
How would you fail your people?
One of the other men surrounding him asked. This man had markings on his face that were reserved only for the priests of his god, Tyr.
By failing to avenge them,
Dan answered. Another high priest called out.
Only the dead require vengeance. It is the living that require justice. Which do you seek, boy? Vengeance or justice?
The fire burned brighter, hotter. Dan responded in a near whisper.
Justice. There must be justice. If it is justice you seek, then you may enter and surround the fire. But if it is only vengeance you crave, then you must walk that path alone.
Silas shouted over the roar of thunder as he waved his staff in a circular motion, turning the pillar of fire into a flaming portal. Bright white light emerged from the other side. It was blinding to Dan, but he could see the portal was closing, becoming smaller with each passing second.
Justice is what I seek. I need to sit beside the warmth and light of the fire, with those who seek it also.
Dan answered passionately.
Then come in.
Dan leapt into the fire. He emerged in another place. It was a large hall constructed with majestic stone pillars. Dan had never seen such magnificent architecture. There were colorful flags and tapestries hanging from the walls, each bearing symbolic imagery of the ancient order. Dan studied each one as he moved closer to the dais at the head of the great hall. A large flame burned with power and blinding light from a circle in the middle of the hall. He moved closer. The heat restored him. The light reassured him. This was a place of the gods. The high priest Keelan Thiel welcomed him.
Dan Tenuviel, son of Ulrich, do you wish to follow the path to the light and away from the darkness? I do,
he answered.
Do you renounce your vengeance and pledge yourself to the cause of truth and justice henceforth? I do,
he said.
Then we welcome you. Learn here, grow strong, embrace the power of the flame that burns for those who seek justice.
With that, Dan Tenuviel had pledged himself, his life, and his sacred honor to join the Order of the Sacred Fire as its newest initiate. His battle was now won with that of the Order, his sword, and the hand that wielded it, the pledged property of his assigned master, the High Lord Galglados of Einderhall. Dan had heard legends from his brothers of his prowess in battle. Now the youngest Tenuviel would be learning the art of war under his direct teaching. This instruction would be aided by the tutelage of some of the known world's greatest fighters, the true masters of martial skill, without distraction or delay, just a keen focus on the development of his innate fighting skills. Several days later, Fergus and Theos finally arrived at Castle Voss and the Temple of the Flame to deliver the bad news to their masters. They approached the assembled priests, lords, and mages with stoic faces, surrounded by a line of finely armored spearmen. Fergus looked up to his high priest and spoke with apprehension.
Great ones, it is with our deep regrets we must inform you.
He hesitated out of pure embarrassment.
Yes? What is it?
Demanded Keelan Thiel, the high priest of the Order, and Fergus's master and mentor. Fergus was ashamed to admit his failure.
The young Tenuviel. We were able to secure his release from Tavor and Bishop. But en route, he ran off in the night unseen. Try as I might, I could not augur his whereabouts. I fear he may be dead. I beg your forgiveness for this failure.
Fergus prostrated himself before the triumvirate, the high priest, high mage, and high lord of the Order.
Rest assured, my son, he is fine.
The high priest motioned to the column of soldiers arranged beside them, and Dan emerged. He made one step forward when signaled to do so by his lord. He was already stepped in the highly regimented and intense training of Galglados, who stood alongside his new initiates with great pride.
Dan, thanks be to the All-Father. You're alive.
Fergus was struck by how serious Dan looked, but then Dan couldn't help but crack a smile. Fergus turned to his master.
I am pleased, my lord, that you were able to find him. I apologize.
Spare us the apologies, Fergus. We understood what we asked you to do, and we expected you would likely encounter some resistance. Your diplomatic performance was excellent, and your mission is complete. You may return to the All Gods Church.
Fergus looked over again to Dan, bowed to his master, and then returned to his study. Dan remained under the intense training of Galglados for over a year before engaging in any missions with the Order outside of the Castle Voss. Galglados was a renowned fighter and proficient in every weapon known to man. Dan also had the unique opportunity to study sword combat with Ramthar of Promethea before he left for his mission east to Cantum. Dan's quick study of the sword and sheer talent was perfectly matched with this lord's tutelage, though both of these masters had to work him harder than any of the others to hammer out his stubborn ego, which had grown quite large during his days of successful thievery with me. That kind of swagger was necessary for his survival amongst the guild of hoodlums that were under my command. During the next 5 years of training and subsequent missions, he grew into an outstanding fighter and was offered a permanent place within a subsect of the Order that was led by Fergus. Fergus had recently taken on the leadership of the White Flame, which had been dormant for many years. This made Dan an official member of the Order, but most importantly, gave him back the feeling of home and family he had lost as a child, regained with me, and then lost again after his arrest in Bishop. He felt blessed and whole. He was finally part of something meaningful again, and harnessed a keen spiritual side with growing fondness for Fergus and a better understanding of his teachings of the Allfather. But despite his oath, his promise, and duty for vengeance never left him completely. It festered deep in his soul and often returned to him in his dreams, despite Fergus's best efforts to exorcise it.